The news came on a bitterly cold night, carried by a raven whose black feathers were dusted with snow. John read the letter by the dim glow of a torch, his gloved hands tightening around the parchment as his eyes moved over the words. You are John Stark, son of Eddard Stark, rightful heir to Winterfell. I have named you Warden of the North. Rule it well, brother. Robb Stark's seal, a direwolf pressed into dark wax, was stamped at the bottom. The letter had come from the Riverlands, where Robb was fighting the war. John's heart pounded in his chest, disbelief and shock warring within him. A Stark, not Snow, not a bastard. The thought was almost too much to grasp. He had spent his life knowing he was different, an outcast in his own home. He had found a place in the Night's Watch, sworn an oath to the wall, but this letter, this single piece of parchment, had changed everything. Ghost, his direwolf, let out a low growl beside him. John looked up. Samwell Tarly stood there, his round face pale in the torchlight. John, what is it? John swallowed hard. Robb has legitimized me. He named me Warden of the North. Sam's eyes widened. You mean he's making you his heir? John nodded. It seems that way. Sam's mouth opened and closed. But you took the black. That was the problem, wasn't it? The Night's Watch oath bound him for life. He had sworn to have no titles, no lands. Yet here it was, a destiny John had never dared to dream of, placed into his hands. A cold wind howled outside, rattling the wooden walls of Castle Black. The world outside was changing. The wildlings were gathering. The White Walkers had returned. And now, this. John knew he had to make a choice. John stood atop the wall, the letter from Robb clutched in his gloved hand. The wind howled around him, cutting through his furs like a blade, but he barely noticed. His mind was trapped in a storm far colder than any northern wind. A Stark, Warden of the North. His heart warred against his duty. He had sworn an oath to the Night's Watch, bound himself to the wall, to the defense of the realm against what lurked beyond. Yet the words on the parchment burned into his mind. If Robb had written this, it meant he was desperate. Something must have happened, something grave enough that his brother needed him to abandon his vows and take up the mantle of Winterfell. Ghost stood beside him, silent as ever, his red eyes fixed on the vast darkness beyond the wall. John let out a slow breath, his decision weighing heavy on his soul. Behind him, footsteps crunched against the frozen walkway. He turned to see Lord Commander Jeor Mormont approaching, his heavy fur cloak dragging against the snow-dusted stone. The old man's face was hard, unreadable. I hear you received an interesting letter, Mormont said, his voice gruff as ever. John clenched his jaw. Yes, my lord. The king in the north has legitimized you, Mormont continued, eyeing John carefully. Made you Warden of the North. John hesitated before nodding. He has. Mormont studied him for a long moment, then turned to look out over the wall. Your father was the most honorable man I ever knew. I watched him ride into battle when I was younger, saw how fiercely he defended the North. The kind of man he was. John remained silent, his hands tightening around the letter. Mormont turned back to him, his expression unreadable. And I know what he would say now. John's chest tightened. He would tell me to keep my oath. Mormont nodded. Aye, he would. The Lord Commander sighed, his breath misting in the cold. But he is dead and war is upon us. These are not normal times. John swallowed hard. He had expected Mormont to reprimand him, to remind him of his duty to the Night's Watch. Instead, there was something else in the old man's voice, something close to understanding, Mormont placed a heavy hand on Jon's shoulder. You are needed here, boy. But the North needs you too. You have a choice to make, and no one can make it for you. Jon clenched his fists. If he stayed, he would be a man of the Night's Watch, bound to his duty. If he left, he would break his vows but take up his father's mantle, protect the North as a Stark should. Before he could respond, the horn blew, once, twice. Jon's blood ran cold. Wildlings. The choice would have to wait. The sound of the horn echoed through the frozen night, bouncing off the icy walls and filling Jon's chest with dread. Twice. That meant wildlings. Jon turned to Mormont, who had already started moving. Get your sword, boy, we've no time to waste. Jon sprinted down the wooden steps, Ghost at his side, his mind momentarily set aside from the letter. He had a duty to fulfill. Whatever his name, Snow or Stark, right now he was a man of the Night's Watch. By the time Jon reached the courtyard, the brothers of the Watch were already scrambling to arm themselves. Men shoved steel helmets onto their heads, swords rang as they were unsheathed, and the great wooden gates were barred. Ed Tollett ran to Jon, his face paler than usual. Scouts say Mance Raider's men are moving in fast, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Jon exchanged a glance with Sam, who stood behind Ed, struggling to strap a dagger to his belt with shaking hands. They've come early, Jon muttered. He had expected Mance's army to take their time preparing an assault, but it seemed the wildlings had grown impatient. Mormont barked orders from atop the stairway. Archers to the walls. Defend the gate. If one of those savages gets through, I'll have your bloody heads myself. The men rushed into position. Jon climbed the nearest guard tower and looked out beyond the wall. His breath caught in his throat. The wildlings were coming like a dark tide. Torches lit up the night, moving like a sea of fire beneath a frozen sky. Giant shadows moved among them. Actual giants, their massive figures illuminated by the flames. Mammoths trudged forward, their riders wielding spears as long as trees. Jon felt a deep pit of worry settle in his stomach. This wasn't just a raid, this was war. A war the Night's Watch was not prepared for. Loose arrows, Mormont bellowed. The twang of bowstrings filled the air as black-feathered shafts rained down upon the advancing wildlings. Screams erupted as the first wave of attackers fell, but it barely slowed them. Jon knocked an arrow, aimed for a man sprinting, toward the wall, and released. The arrow struck true, dropping the wildling in the snow. But it wasn't enough. The giants reached the wall's massive gate and began slamming their enormous clubs against it. Wood splintered. The Watch's defenses wouldn't last long. Jon's mind raced. If they lost the wall, the North would be defenseless. Even as Warden of the North, he wouldn't have the men to stop the wildlings from pouring into Winterfell, into every village and Holdfast beyond. A terrible realization hit him. I have no choice. Jon gritted his teeth, turned to Ed and Sam and spoke over the chaos. We can't win this fight, not like this. Sam's face was filled with fear. Then what do we do? Jon took a deep breath. The words tasted like treason. I have to go. I have to take my rightful place as Warden of the North. Ed stared at him. You're leaving? Jon looked over his shoulder at the battle. The Watch was losing and the wall was about to fall. He had no time to explain, no time to argue. I'll return, Jon said. But I need an army, and there's only one place I can get one. He turned to Ghost and whispered, We ride for Winterfell. Then gripping his sword tight, Jon Snow, Jon Stark, vanished into the night. The wind howled as Jon Stark rode south, the wall vanishing behind him into the darkness. Ghost loped beside his horse, his white fur blending with the snow. Every hoofbeat against the frozen ground pounded the weight of his decision into his skull. He had broken his vows. He had abandoned his brothers. But the North needed him. As he rode, memories of Winterfell clawed their way into his mind. The stone walls, the smell of hot bread from the kitchens, the sound of Bran laughing as he climbed, the towers. Home. A place he had never truly belonged to, yet always yearned for. He would take it back. But first he needed men. The journey was brutal. The North was vast and the roads were treacherous with ice and snow. He avoided the King's Road, knowing that any loyalist to the Boltons or the Lannisters might recognize him. Instead, he rode through the deep woods, following the trails only the hunters of Winterfell had known. After days of harsh travel, Jon reached Deepwood Motte, the stronghold of House Glover. He knew that the Glovers had once been loyal to Robb, but now their allegiance was uncertain. As he approached the gates, the guards stepped forward, swords drawn. "Who goes there?" one called. Jon pulled back his hood. His hair was unkempt, his face rough with days of travel, but his gray Stark eyes gleamed in the firelight. "I am Jon Stark, son of Eddard Stark, and I have come to reclaim the North." The guards hesitated. Murmurs spread through them. They had heard of Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell, but Jon Stark? That was something new. After a tense moment, one of the men turned and ran toward the keep. Moments later, the great wooden doors creaked open and Lord Robert Glover stepped out, his eyes sharp with suspicion. "I thought you were dead," Glover said bluntly. "I thought the North still had honor," Jon replied. Glover's expression darkened, but he waved Jon inside. "You'd best explain yourself." Inside, Jon sat before the hearth, warming his frozen hands as he spoke. "The Boltons murdered my brother. They hold Winterfell in my family's name, and they will not stop until the North is broken under their rule." His voice was steady, though anger burned beneath it. "I am no bastard. Robb legitimized me before his death. I am Jon Stark, and I mean to take back my home." Glover exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his beard. "You expect me to believe that you're Robb's heir? That some piece of parchment makes you a Stark?" Jon stood, his cloak billowing behind him. "I don't need you to believe it. I need you to fight." He met Glover's gaze, unflinching. "You were loyal to my father. You were loyal to Robb. Will you abandon their son now, when the North needs you most?" The fire crackled between them. Glover's hands clenched into fists. "I fought for Robb," Glover said finally. "And we lost. I lost my lands to the Ironborn. My people suffered. And when we needed Winterfell, where was it? Where was House Stark?" Jon felt the sting of the words, but he didn't look away. House Stark is still here. Silence stretched between them. Then finally, Glover sighed. "You have the look of your father. And your mother, whoever she was." His voice was quieter now. "If what you say is true, if you are truly the last Stark to stand against the Boltons." Jon waited. Glover nodded. "Then you have my sword." A weight lifted from Jon's chest. The North was stirring. The wolves were waking. But this was only the beginning. Jon spent the next few days rallying more northern lords. He rode to House Mormont, where young Lyanna Mormont declared that the North remembers. He rode to the remnants of House Umber, convincing them to turn against the Boltons. He sent ravens to the loyal clans of the mountains, promising them that Winterfell would rise again. And then, with his army gathering behind him, he turned toward Winterfell, toward Ramsay Bolton. The battle for the North had begun. The banners, of the north rose against the gray sky, flapping in the bitter wind as Jon Stark stood at the head of his army. Snow swirled around them, thick and heavy, coating the ground in a blanket of white. The men beside him shivered, but Jon felt nothing. His blood burned too hot for the cold to touch him. Winterfell was in sight. From where he stood atop a ridge, he could see the great walls of his family's home. Smoke curled lazily from its chimneys, the high towers standing against the bleak sky like silent sentinels. This was where he had been raised, where his father had ruled with honor, and now it belonged to Ramsay Bolton, not for much longer. Ghost stood beside him, his red eyes glowing in the snow. The direwolf let out a low growl, sensing the bloodshed to come. Jon reached down, resting a hand on Ghost's thick fur, his own heart thrumming like a war drum. Behind him, his forces waited. The banners of House Glover, House Mormont, and the Mountain Clan stood alongside his own direwolf sigil. Their numbers were fewer than he would have liked, but they were men of the North, hardened by the land, fueled by vengeance. At the center of his war council, Robert Glover, Lyanna Mormont, and the other northern lords watched him expectantly. Ramsay has the numbers, Glover said grimly, arms crossed. He holds the walls, the supplies, the high ground. Attacking Winterfell head-on will be suicide. Jon nodded. He had fought enough battles to know that charging blindly would only lead to slaughter. Ramsay was cruel, but he wasn't a fool. He had his father's cunning, and he would expect an attack. But Jon had no intention of fighting on Ramsay's terms. "We won't attack the walls," Jon said, his voice steady. "We'll draw him out." Lyanna Mormont raised a brow. "And how do you plan to do that?" Jon exhaled slowly. He hated the answer, but there was no other way. "We give him something he can't ignore." Silence hung between them. Glover narrowed his eyes. "You mean to use bait?" Jon nodded. Glover frowned. "And what bait could possibly make that mad dog leave his castle?" Jon's jaw tightened. "Me." Dawn broke with an eerie stillness. The snow had stopped falling, and the world was painted in shades of gray. Jon rode alone, toward Winterfell's gates. His army remained hidden in the hills, watching from the shadows. Every muscle in his body was taut, every nerve screaming at him to turn back. But he did not. He had learned one thing from Ramsay Bolton. Monsters could not resist a challenge, and Jon was offering himself as the greatest challenge of all. The gates of Winterfell groaned open. A lone rider emerged, clad in black armor, his face twisted in a smirk. Ramsay Bolton. Jon had never hated a man more. "So the bastard comes home," Ramsay called, reining in his horse just feet away. His pale blue eyes flickered with amusement. "I must say I expected you to be rotting on the wall. How disappointing." Jon did not react. "Your reign is over." Ramsay laughed. "And who will take it from me?" "You?" He leaned forward in the saddle. "You have no army. You have no allies. You are alone." Jon met his gaze unflinching. "Am I?" The moment the words left his mouth, the horns of the north blew. From the hills, thousands of men charged forward, their banners snapping in the wind. The warriors of House Mormont, House Glover, and the free folk surged from the shadows, a tide of steel and fury. Ramsay's smirk faltered. Jon drew Longclaw. For Winterfell, the battle had begun. The battle erupted in chaos. Jon Stark led the charge, Longclaw gleaming in the pale morning light as his army surged forward like a storm. The snow beneath them turned to ice and mud as steel met flesh. The screams of dying, men filling the cold air. Ramsay Bolton's forces were caught off guard. His soldiers scrambled to form ranks, but the North had risen against him, and they were not here to show mercy. Arrows whistled through the air, cutting down men before they could even raise their shields. The Mormont warriors, small in number, but fierce as wolves, cut through Ramsay's flank with terrifying speed. The mountain clans, their war cries echoing across the field, hacked into Bolton lines like madmen. Jon fought at the center, Ghost tearing through enemies beside him. He had no time to think, only react. A soldier swung a blade toward him, but Jon parried, spun, and drove Longclaw through the man's chest. More came. He cut one down, then another. Blood splattered across his face, warm despite the freezing air. He hardly noticed. Ramsay, from the safety of his warhorse, watched the carnage with narrowed eyes. He hadn't expected Jon to command such loyalty. He had underestimated the North. "Loose the hounds," Ramsay ordered. At his signal, a dozen of his war dogs were released from their cages. The monstrous beasts, bred for slaughter, tore across the battlefield, their handlers shouting commands. Jon saw them coming. He had seen what Ramsay's dogs could do. Ghost snarled and leapt forward, meeting the first hound head-on. The two beasts crashed into each other, a blur of white and brown fur, snapping jaws and slashing claws. Ghost sank his teeth into the hound's throat, ripping it apart. But there were more. Jon barely had time to react before another lunged at him. He raised his arm just in time. Teeth sank into his forearm, pain exploding through him as the beast tried to pull him to the ground. A flash of steel. The dog collapsed, blood spilling from its throat. Jon looked up. Lyanna Mormont, barely past 13, had driven a spear into the beast's neck. She pulled it free, wiping the blood on her furs. "The North remembers," she growled. Jon forced himself to his feet, pain forgotten. The battle raged on, but his men were winning, and now it was time to end it. Jon's eyes locked onto Ramsay, still sitting atop his horse, still watching as if the battle was nothing more than a game. Not this time. Jon pushed forward, cutting, through Bolton men like a man possessed. He saw Tormund Giantsbane rip a soldier apart with his bare hands. He saw Robert Glover drive his sword through a Bolton knight's visor. Everywhere he looked, Ramsay's men were dying. Winterfell was slipping from his grasp, and Ramsay knew it. His smirk faded. He turned his horse, spurring it back toward the gates. He was running. Jon wasn't about to let that happen. "After him," he shouted. He and his men pursued, cutting down the last of Ramsay's forces as they stormed Winterfell's gates. The Bolton banners burned, torn down by the Northmen as they fought their way into the castle. Ramsay was trapped, and Jon was coming for him. The gates of Winterfell crashed open, and Jon Stark led the charge into his family's home. The North had returned, and the Bolton banners burned as men stormed through the courtyard, cutting down the last of Ramsay's forces. Jon barely noticed the chaos around him. His vision had narrowed to one purpose: find Ramsay. End him. Ghost loped ahead, his white fur streaked with blood as he sniffed the air, tracking the coward who had stolen Winterfell. Jon followed without hesitation, boots pounding against the cold stone. Through the halls of Winterfell, the memories of his childhood flashed before him, the warm glow of the great hearth, the sound of his siblings' laughter. But that warmth had been stolen. Ramsay had turned Winterfell into a place of torture, of cruelty. No more. A scream echoed ahead. A Bolton soldier stumbled backward, eyes wide in horror as Ghost leapt onto him, tearing his throat out. The man hit the ground, gurgling. Ghost lifted his head, blood dripping from his fangs, and growled. Jon stepped over the corpse and pushed forward. At the end of the corridor, a figure stood waiting. Ramsay Bolton. The bastard of the Dreadfort leaned against a stone pillar, his lips curled into a smirk, but Jon saw the truth in his eyes. Fear. "I must admit," Ramsay said casually, though his voice was tight. "I didn't think you had it in you." He tilted his head. "A Snow fighting a Bolton. How poetic." Jon didn't answer. He drew Longclaw, the Valyrian steel catching the flickering torchlight. "It's over." Ramsay chuckled, but it was hollow. "You think killing me will change anything?" He gestured lazily around them. "The North bends to power. Do you really think they will follow a man who once swore the black?" Jon stepped closer, his grip tightening on his sword. "They already do." Ramsay's smirk faltered. For the first time in his life, the bastard of the Dreadfort had no way out. No tricks, no dogs, no allies. Jon lunged. Ramsay barely had time to draw his daggers before Jon was on him. The first strike sent him staggering back, his leather armor splitting beneath the Valyrian steel. He tried to counter, slashing with his twin blades, but Jon was faster. Steel clashed, sparks flying as Jon forced Ramsay back with brutal, unrelenting blows. Ramsay had spent his life tormenting others, hunting girls for sport, breaking men who couldn't fight back. But Jon was not weak. Jon was not prey. Ramsay's breathing turned ragged as he tripped over a fallen chair, landing hard against the stone floor. Jon stood over him, chest heaving, Longclaw's tip pressed against Ramsay's throat. For a moment there was silence. Then Ramsay smiled, his teeth stained red. "Go on then. Do it." Jon's grip tightened. Every part of him screamed to drive, his blade through the bastard's heart, to make him suffer the way he had made Sansa suffer, the way he had tortured Theon, the way he had flayed men alive. But death was too easy for Ramsay Bolton. Jon lowered his sword. "No," he said. Ramsay blinked, his smirk faltering. "No?" Jon turned away, whistling for Ghost. The direwolf padded forward, his red eyes burning with hunger. "You starve your dogs," Jon said, stepping back. "Let's see how hungry they are." Ramsay's expression finally cracked. Real fear. The doors opened. From the kennels the hounds emerged, their massive forms slinking into the dim torchlight, their yellow eyes locked onto their former master. Jon didn't watch what happened next. As Ramsay's screams filled the halls of Winterfell, Jon walked away, Ghost at his side. The North was free, and Winterfell belonged to the Starks once more. The halls of Winterfell were quiet after the storm of battle. The fires still burned, the bodies still lay where they had fallen. But the screams had faded. The Bolton banners had been ripped down, their flayed man sigil trampled into the mud and snow. Jon Stark stood in the great hall, staring at the high seat that had once belonged to his father. The seat of the Warden of the North. It should have been Robb's. But Robb was dead. The North had suffered. Betrayed at the twins, butchered by the Boltons, crushed under the weight of Southern rule. And yet it had risen again. Jon had led them here, but now he stood at a crossroads. What came next? The doors opened and Sansa walked in, wrapped in a thick cloak of white wolf fur. The bruises Ramsay had left on her were fading, but the coldness in her eyes remained. "It's over," she said. Jon turned to her, searching her face. "Is it?" She hesitated, stepping closer. "You saved us. You saved Winterfell." Jon sighed. "I broke my vows." Sansa's brow furrowed. "The Night's Watch?" Jon nodded. "I swore an oath. No lands, no titles. And yet here I stand." She studied him for a long moment. Then she reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "Jon, you are a Stark." The words settled deep in his chest. Jon Stark. The name still felt strange, like a borrowed cloak that didn't quite fit. But it was his now. Outside, the northern lords had gathered. Glover, Mormont, the mountain clans. They stood in the courtyard waiting. The war was won, but they needed a leader. Someone to rebuild the north. Jon turned back to Sansa. They will name you Lady of Winterfell. You're the true-born heir. Sansa's lips pressed together. They won't. Jon frowned. Why not? She exhaled, glancing toward the open door where the northern lords were gathered. Because they already chose. A horn blew, calling Jon outside. The snow fell softly as he stepped into the courtyard. The men turned as he approached. Some wore armor still stained with blood. Others clutched their banners. But they all looked at him the same way, as if waiting for something. Lyanna Mormont stepped forward first. The girl was small, but her voice was strong as steel. "My lords," she called out, her young face fierce. "House Mormont remembers. We remember the true king in the north. We remember Ned Stark's blood." She turned to Jon. "And we remember the man who fought for Winterfell when no one else would." Jon stiffened as she dropped to one knee. "The king in the north," she declared. A rumble of voices followed. Robert Glover knelt next, slamming his fist to his chest. "The king in the north." One by one the lords fell to their knees. The mountain clans. The warriors of Deepwood Motte. Even the last of the Karstarks once sworn to the Boltons bent their heads. Jon stood frozen, his heart hammering. They were looking to him, not to Sansa, not to some distant Targaryen or Lannister. To him, he turned to his sister. Sansa met his gaze, her blue eyes unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. Jon swallowed hard. Then, with the weight of the North on his shoulders, he stepped forward and spoke. "The North will never kneel again." A roar of approval echoed through Winterfell. Jon Stark was no longer just Warden. Of the North, he was king. But kings don't rule in peace for long, and beyond the wall something dark was coming.